Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum. Today's topic is about the charities or the sadaqat according to the Quran. So, now that we know that sadaqat is associated with infaq, let's go deeper into the topic of sadaqat. According to the Quran, sadaqat can be optional or obligatory. So we see that sadaqat is optional in some verses of the Quran, and I'll give you a couple of examples, like in Surah 2 verse 196. And conclude the Hajj and the Umrah for God, but if you are prevented, then provide what offering is affordable. Whoever of you is ill or has an ailment to his head, then he may redeem by a withholding or a sadaqatan or a right. So sadaqatan here is in the context of an option as redemption. Okay. Then we go to Surah 4 verse 92. It is not for a believer to kill another believer except by accident, and whoever kills a believer by accident, then he shall free a believing slave and give the compensation to the family, except if they yasaddaqu, remit it. Okay, they leave it out as a charity. So again, they have the option to give this as a charity. This indicates that some aspects of sadaqat are an option. Okay, now what we're really going to focus on is whether the sadaqat is obligatory according to the Quran or not. According to the Quran, the spending of sadaqat is an obligation. We go to Surah 2 verse 267. O you who believe, you shall spend. Anfiqu. This is an imperative verb. It's a command. Anfiqu, from the good things that you have earned and from what we have brought forth from the earth. Do not select the rotten out of it to give while you would not take it yourselves. In the next passage it says, and whatever you spend anfaqtum out of your monies, or whatever you pledge as a promise, then God knows it. If you openly give sadaqat, then it is acceptable, but if you conceal them and give them to the poor, then that is better for you. So here we see that God is issuing an imperative of a command, okay, a command to spend. This is a requirement. Then he specifies the sadaqat, and he gives us the option as to in what fashion we can give the sadaqat. But nonetheless, the bottom line, sadaqat is required. We go to Surah 4 verse 4, which is interesting. It says, give the women their saduqatihinna. Here God calls the women's dowry as a truth, saduqatihinna. And one can actually argue that this is not a charity. Sure, we can argue that. However, God is using the word saduqatihinna here for a very good reason, because the word means truth. Give the women their truth. Okay, so their dowry is called a truth because it signifies the truth of the relationship, the bond that's happening in marriage. Give the women their saduqatihinna. Then God says, and if they remit any of it to you of their own will, then you may take it. Okay, so the bottom line is that you still must give the sadaqat or the saduqat. And if they choose to subsequently remit any of it, that is perfectly fine. But bottom line, this is still a requirement. Okay, we go to Surah 58. It says, O you who believe, if you wish to hold a private meeting with a messenger, you shall offer a sadaqah before you do so. This again is required. Then God says, if you cannot do so, then God is forgiver, merciful. So again, we see that God requires us to give a sadaqah if we're holding a meeting with a messenger. You are required to do that. But if you can't, then God is forgiver, merciful. So these verses show that indeed the spending of sadaqat is an obligation. Let's see the next slide. So now I would like to share with you a passage that's going to teach us that sadaqat is indeed an obligation and gives us a distribution list. This is located in Surah 9. We'll start at verse 53. It says, "Say, spend, anfiqu, willingly or unwillingly, it will not be accepted from you. You are a wicked people." Here the Prophet is speaking to the hypocrites. In the next verse it says, "And what prevented what they would spend from being accepted from them, except that they rejected God and His Messenger, and they do not attend the salah except lazily, and they do not spend yunfiquna except unwillingly." Then it says, "And from them are those who criticize you, Muhammad, regarding the sadaqat. If they are given from it, they are content, and if they are not given from it, they become enraged. Indeed, the sadaqat are for the poor, the needy, and those who work to collect them, and those whose hearts have been united, and to free the slaves, and those in debt, and in the cause of God, and the wayfarer, a duty from God, and God is knowledgeable, wise." So we really need to stop and reflect here. What is going on here? God here in verse 60 is very, very specific. God tells us that the sadaqat are to be given to a specific group of people. He gives us a distribution list, and then he says, a duty from God, faridatan min Allah. This should lay to rest any type of arguments as far as what sadaqat is and whether they are optional or obligatory. What's interesting is that in traditional Islam, they actually do a tafsir of this verse, and they'll tell you that this verse actually refers to the zakah, even though the verse itself says sadaqat. So in the next slide, we're going to delve a little deeper into verse 960. So in 960, which is crystal clear as far as what the sadaqat are, God says that the sadaqat are to be given to a specific group of people, a distribution list. Then he says, a duty from God, faridatan min Allah. Now please note that even if we are to remove this phrase, a duty from God, if it were not in this verse, the verse would still make perfect sense. So why is it really there? What's the purpose of this phrase? Well, the word duty in Arabic is farida, and it comes from the root farada, which means to create a notch or a slit to limit the movement of something. What this indicates is that God is limiting the categories of where the sadaqat are to go. What this indicates is that the farida, not only does it mean it's an obligation, it means that God is narrowing down the categories of the people that are to be given the sadaqat. In Arabic, a farida or a farada is usually referred to something in a bow and arrow. And it's a notch or a slit that the arrow is placed to limit the movement of that arrow. So once again, this indicates that God is limiting the movement of, or the categories of people that are to receive the sadaqat. They are to go to the poor. This means they are not to go to the rich. So let's take some verses that actually uses the term farada in the Quran. Surah 4 verse 7. For the men is a portion from what the parents and their relatives left behind, and for the women is a portion from what the parents and relatives left behind, be it little or much, a portion that is mafruda. And I here put forced limit. This means the mafruda, God is narrowing down whom should receive the portion, and it needs to be both men and women. So God is limiting it. You cannot just say the men, or you cannot just say only the women. It's both. This means that it's both a forced limit that is a requirement. Surah 2 verse 197. The Hajj are months that are known, so whoever forced limit in them for the Hajj. We know that the Hajj is 4 months long, but the Hajj itself can be only a few days. So when you limit yourself to those few days, you are forced limit yourself to those 4 days. So once again, the significance of having this phrase indicates not only is it an obligation, but it also indicates that we are narrowing down the list of the distribution. Now, what's interesting is that the traditional Muslims will quote a couple of verses from the Quran to say that these verses talk about the zakah. Surah 6 verse 141 is one of them. It says, "Eat from its fruit when it blossoms and give its due on the day of harvest." Here they'll tell you that give its due is in reference to the zakah. But unfortunately, we don't see the word zakah used here, nor do we see any term, the term zakah used in any of the verses that we have demonstrated as far as the charities and the spending is concerned. In fact, if we just look at the word haqqahu that is used here, its due is the Arabic word haqqahu, and from the root it means fact. Haqq means fact. And note how this word is basically a cousin definition of the sadaqat, which means truth. Fact and truth. They're related key terms. The other verse that they are talking about is Surah 17 verse 26, which uses the same term, haqqahu. Okay, so the point still stands. Haqqahu is related to the sadaqah, which is the truth, fact and truth. And this verse also gives a distribution list similar to the verses that talk about spending as well as the sadaqat. Here it says the relative, the needy, and the wayfarer, and we see the same distribution list in Surah 2 verse 215. They ask you what they should spend. Say what you spend out of goodness should go to your family, the relatives, the needy, and the wayfarer, the same list mentioned in Surah 17 verse 26. And we also see the same thing in Surah 9 verse 60. So this idea that these verses, the verses that talk about haqqahu are referring to zakah is completely wrong. We are looking at what the Quran, and we're cross-referencing the verses that talk about the sadaqat and the infaq, which are related to these verses. So we can safely say that the sadaqat, we have seen from the Quran that the sadaqat, the Quran gives us a distribution list of the sadaqat, the spending of sadaqat, and the forced limit of sadaqat. And we don't see any of that in reference to the zakah. All of this teaches us that the sadaqat, according to the Quran, can be optional based on certain situations, and it's also an obligation that has a distribution list given to us in the Quran. So let's wrap all of this information up. The word infaq and sadaqat in the Quran go hand in hand. They mean spending and charities respectively. And according to the Quran, the sadaqat is an obligation that contains a distribution list, as we have seen in Surah 9 verse 60. And we also see that these things are required in order for us to enter paradise. Surah 63 verse 10 indicates so. And God also tells us that we are to use the excess of the monies and our spendings to contribute to that, according to Surah 2 verse 219 and 17:29. And these are to spend from our own earnings, Surah 2 verse 267. So I pray that this has helped you understand that the sadaqat in the Quran is an obligation according to the Quran, and they contain a distribution list. They are not to be confused as the zakah. Wassalamu alaikum.